"Sir, step away from the piano. You're making the guests uncomfortable." He didn't answer. He just sat down, touched one trembling key, and silenced an entire room. What began as mockery of a disheveled stranger crashing a luxury gala turned to something no one expected. Within minutes, this nobody played a melody so haunting, so familiar, it brought the wealthiest audience to tears, including a grieving widow who recognized the long-lost composition written for her late daughter. What no one knew? The man they laughed at was James Langford, an undercover billionaire who vanished after losing his family. His return wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption, about finishing a song he once abandoned and helping the world find its voice again. This is not just a story about music. It's about second chances, quiet strength, and the power of a single note to heal the deepest wounds. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the piano." The voice cut through the clinking of champagne flutes like a blade. It belonged to a tall man in a white tuxedo jacket, his posture stiff with offense, his nose just slightly tilted as if the scent of poverty had offended him. His name was Carson Holloway, vice president of the hosting committee, and he was already drawing glances from half the room. They were standing at the edge of the grand stage inside the Whitmore Conservatory, where the polished black Steinway sat like a crown jewel beneath the spotlight. The man he was addressing, however, didn't flinch. He stood hunched slightly at the shoulders, his salt and pepper hair curling at the nape of his neck, his beard unkempt. His jacket was wrinkled, thrifted, worn at the cuffs. He looked like someone who had wandered in from the cold, not someone meant to be here, among pearls, tuxedos, and old money. And yet he didn't move. Instead, he placed his hands softly, almost reverently, on the piano bench, as though remembering something far away. Carson scoffed. "Sir, this is a formal gala. That instrument is worth more than most people's houses. Please, before you embarrass yourself further." A wave of snickers rippled through the crowd behind them. A woman in a red satin gown whispered to her date, "Is he part of the entertainment? Some kind of performance art?" But the man didn't answer. He simply lowered himself onto the bench, his motions slow but steady, as if his body moved on memory alone. From the far end of the hall, a boy no more than 12 clutched his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom?" He looked sad. He was right. The man's eyes weren't filled with defiance or confusion. They were filled with a quiet ache, the kind that speaks of nights spent awake at pianos no one else could hear, of songs written in silence because grief had taken away the words. One of the musicians backstage peeked out and frowned. "Who is that?" he asked a fellow performer. "No clue, but I'd kill to know what he's about to play." Back near the Steinway, Carson was growing impatient. "Security," he barked, motioning to a guard near the door. "Escort him out. We don't have time for this." Before the guard could move, a soft, clear voice cut through the air. "Let him play," came the words from Eleanor Braithwaite, seated in the front row, her white gloves clutching the arms of her chair. Her age-worn face was framed by soft curls, and her voice, though weathered, carried the same weight it always had. She was the patron saint of the conservatory, its largest donor and its most respected voice. Carson turned, clearly flustered. "Mrs. Braithwaite, I don't think?" "I said," she repeated without looking away from the man at the piano. "Let him play." There was a pause, a long one. Then the guard stepped back. The room shifted. What had been casual mockery now twisted into tense anticipation. The lighting technician, unsure whether to dim the lights or not, froze. Waitstaff with trays of oysters stopped mid-step. The man didn't look at the audience, didn't smile, didn't even adjust the bench. He lifted his hands and then he paused. For a single second, the air inside the hall stilled. It was the moment before the storm breaks, the breath before the first snowfall, the hush that overtakes a chapel right before the wedding march begins. And then he played, just one note. A single, trembling C, delicate, pure, like a snowflake landing on glass. And that was all it took. The laughter that had been bubbling in the back of the room died without a sound. A few people furrowed their brows. A couple shifted, uncomfortable with how vulnerable that one note felt. It was as if it reached into some small place in them they hadn't given permission to be touched. But then the second note came. Then a third. And suddenly they weren't random sounds anymore. They were part of something intricate, something ancient and sad and beautiful. The man's hands moved as though guided by a memory older than his body. There was no showmanship, no flair, just emotion measured out in T-strokes. His left hand added a low, haunting line, barely more than a whisper, and the melody began to take shape, slow and aching. Someone near the back dropped their champagne flute. It shattered, but no one turned. They were transfixed. Carson took a step back, visibly disoriented, as if betrayed by an illusion he hadn't realized he was a part of. "What is that song?" someone whispered. No one answered. A young woman in a silver dress covered her mouth, eyes wet. A cellist standing by the exit wiped his eyes before he even realized he was crying. Even the servers, half hidden behind floral displays, stood frozen, captivated by the rawness bleeding from the piano. From her seat in the front row, Eleanor Braithwaite sat stone still. Her breathing had grown shallow and her eyes blinked back a storm. Her gloved hands trembled. "He's playing Solace in G minor," she whispered, voice breaking. The woman beside her frowned. "But that piece was never published." "My husband wrote it," Eleanor said, her hand pressing to her chest. "He composed it for our daughter when she died. Only one handwritten copy exists. It was never performed in public. Not once." Her voice cracked on the last word. Now the melody had deepened, rolling through minor keys, layering grief and tenderness like rain on old stone. The notes didn't seek attention. They sought truth. They didn't demand praise. They asked only to be heard, and the audience obeyed. From balcony to banquet table, not a soul moved. The man at the piano didn't seem to notice. He was somewhere else entirely, inside a memory, a wound, a moment only he could see. But they all felt it. The music swelled, an aching crescendo that felt like the sun rising behind clouds heavy with sorrow. For just a moment, even the crystal chandeliers above seemed to flicker in rhythm. And just as suddenly as it had begun, the music faded. The final note rang out, then fell away, like a leaf caught in wind. And then, silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't empty. It was full of breath held too long, hearts opened too wide. It was sacred. No one clapped. No one dared. The man slowly stood from the bench. His shoulders sagged as though he had poured everything he had left into that song. His eyes, wet and distant, never met the crowd's gaze. He turned quietly, humbly, and began to walk away. No announcement, no name, no acknowledgement, just a man, leaving behind a room forever changed. And as he stepped toward the door, not one person could bring themselves to stop him. Not yet. Because some truths need a little silence to settle first. He reached the door. The golden handle gleamed beneath the crystal light, but his hand hesitated midair, fingers trembling like the last notes of the song still echoing in the bones of everyone behind him. "Wait, sir." The voice cracked from the middle of the room, sharp and sudden, like a window being thrown open after a storm. It belonged to the gala host, Roger Ellington, a tall man in a blue velvet jacket whose reputation was built more on charm than character. But charm had abandoned him now. His words stumbled after the man like a dog chasing something it didn't understand. "Please," Roger said again. Who are you?" The man turned, but only slightly. His face was dim under the shadow of the hallway light, but his eyes were visible now, gray as winter smoke and somehow older than they'd been moments ago. "I'm no one," he said softly. "Just someone who remembered." That was all he offered before pushing through the doors and disappearing into the velvet hush of the hallway. But the silence he left behind was a fragile thing, too delicate to hold. It shattered the moment Eleanor Braithwaite stood. She didn't need help. Despite her age, her back was straight, her steps steady. Her gloves were off now, fingers clenched tightly around a folded handkerchief as she stepped up the stage stairs. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor, reverberating louder than the laughter that had once filled the room. She stopped at the Steinway and reached out, her fingertips brushing the keys. Then slowly she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse. Old parchment, handwritten, her husband's signature at the bottom. A private lullaby never meant for strangers. She turned it, and line by line, note by note, matched what she had just heard. Every flourish, every pause, every breath of silence that lived between chords. It was perfect. It was impossible. She turned toward the crowd. Her voice was soft, but in that stillness it carried like wind through leaves. I never showed this to anyone outside my family, not once. I kept it after Samuel died because it was the last thing he wrote for our little girl. We lost her when she was only 9. Her throat caught, but she didn't waver. That man didn't just know the melody, he played it like he knew her. In the back of the room, the boy who had whispered earlier now clutched his mother tighter. She held him close and kissed his temple, as if she too felt the quiet sacredness trembling through the air. "Eleanor," Roger stammered, stepping forward, "do you know who he is?" She looked at him, her brow raised gently. "Don't you?" I thought he was homeless, a street musician or something. He didn't RSVP. He wasn't on any guest list. I swear." But Eleanor had already turned away. "Get me the security footage," she said to no one in particular, her voice resolute. "Check the door logs, find out where he came from." Behind her, murmurs had started again. But they weren't mocking anymore. They were hushed, reverent, strangely embarrassed, because they knew now that whoever he was, he had walked into their glittering world not to ask for applause, but to offer something they hadn't expected. Truth. And the truth had moved them in ways money never could. Outside, under a sky turning lavender with dusk, the man stepped into the street. The gala's towering columns cast long shadows across the sidewalk, but he didn't look back. His shoes scuffed lightly against the pavement. His hands were still trembling, not from nerves, but from memory. From the weight of having finally let the music out after all those years of silence. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a creased photo. It showed a woman and a girl, arms wrapped around each other, wind in their hair, laughing by a lake in the late autumn sun. On the back, in faded ink, "Come home to us when you're ready." He stared at it for a moment, then folded it again and slipped it back inside. A car pulled up, a sleek black sedan. The driver stepped out and opened the door. "Mr. Langford," he said gently, "everything go as planned?" Langford didn't answer right away, his jaw clenched. Then he nodded. "Yes," he murmured. "It went better than I expected." The driver hesitated, eyes flicking to the piano hall behind them. "Did they recognize you?" "No," Langford replied, "but one day they will. That's not why I went." He slid into the car, the door closing with a quiet click that cut off the rest of the world. Inside, he rested his forehead against the window as the city drifted past. Soft lights, people walking with coffee cups and briefcases, lives unraveling and renewing in ordinary rhythm. He had once been part of this world. James Langford, tech visionary, billionaire, widower. But after the crash that took his wife and daughter, he had vanished. Reporters wrote stories. Some said he fled to Italy. Others claimed he had built a monastery in the Himalayas. But none of them were true. He had stayed right here. Among them, he had bought a small apartment above a bookstore. He walked to parks in the mornings and sat in train stations at night. He wrote music no one heard and watched the world forget him, and for a time, he wanted them to. Until tonight. Until he saw the name on the gala invitation list, Eleanor Braithwaite. And the fundraiser's purpose, to restore public music programs for children in need. That had been his daughter's dream. So he returned. Not as a donor, not as a name on a plaque, but as a man with a memory and a melody too sacred to remain locked inside. Back at the gala, a staff member raced through donor archives and guest logs. Roger stood beside him, staring at the screen as a name finally appeared next to an encrypted code used to access VIP-level entrance. James Langford, the staffer read aloud, registered anonymously through Langford Holdings LLC. Donation, $10 million. Roger nearly choked. 10 million? But Eleanor wasn't surprised. She was already pulling out her phone. She found the photo, one from years ago. A newspaper clipping about Langford's foundation. In it, he was smiling beside his wife and daughter, their arms linked in front of a massive piano inside a children's hospital. Her hand covered her mouth. It had always been him. Roger turned to her, his eyes wide with panic. "We mocked a billionaire." "No," Eleanor corrected gently, her voice like autumn wind. "We mocked a father." A silence fell again, deeper this time, heavier, because suddenly they all realized. Every cruel laugh, every whisper, every doubt had been laid bare by a man who never asked them to apologize. He didn't need to. His music had already spoken louder than any voice in that room ever could. The video surfaced just after midnight. It wasn't meant to go viral. It wasn't even meant to be recorded. One of the waiters, young, observant, and discreet, had instinctively pressed record the moment the disheveled man sat at the piano. Something about him didn't feel like an accident. Something about the silence before his fingers touched the keys felt sacred. And the waiter, whose sister had spent years recovering in a music therapy center, knew better than to look away when a moment like that was about to unfold. He uploaded it anonymously. No hashtags, no captions, just a simple title. Unknown man plays forgotten song, entire hall transforms. By morning, it had reached over 2 million views. By noon, it had reached 10. Across continents and time zones, people watched the stranger's hands move with grief and tenderness across the keys, and they didn't see an intruder. They saw themselves. Comments flooded in. My father used to play this when my mother was sick. I haven't heard it since. I don't even know this piece, but it made me cry. This man isn't playing music. He's releasing ghosts. But it was the silence after the final note, the way the hall sat frozen in reverence, that broke most hearts. That pause said everything about who he was and what he gave. And it was that pause that followed Eleanor Braithwaite long after she left the gala. She stood at the window of her estate, the handkerchief still in her pocket, the parchment sheet clutched in her other hand. Outside, the late morning sun blanketed her garden in quiet gold. Her late husband's roses bloomed along the trellis, wild and a little overgrown, just as he'd liked them. She hadn't touched the piano in years. Not since losing her daughter. Not since the night her husband came home with tear-stained eyes and sat alone for 6 hours, writing a piece no one would ever hear, until now. She walked to the music room. It smelled of old mahogany and lemon polish. The grand piano sat in the corner like a ghost, its lid closed, untouched. She ran her hand along its surface. Dust clung to her fingertips. Slowly she opened the lid. The keys greeted her like old friends, familiar, forgiving. She sat down and unfolded the parchment in front of her. Then, with trembling fingers, she tried to play what she had heard the night before, but she couldn't, because what she heard in her mind wasn't just music. It was James. The way he had breathed through each note, the pain behind every chord, the pauses that weren't pauses but prayers. And Eleanor knew then that what he had shared wasn't just a composition. It was a confession. So she picked up the phone. Not to call a PR team, not to call the board, but to call a friend, a very old friend. His name was Harold Green, former conductor of the London Symphony, now retired. He answered on the second ring, his voice sleepy but warm. "Eleanor," he said, "is everything all right?" "I need a favor," she whispered. "I need help finding a man who disappeared in plain sight." Back in the city, James sat alone at the small upright piano in his apartment. No stage, no crowd, just a skylight spilling pale morning light onto the floor. He played not to remember, but to feel. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. But that peace cracked open when his assistant, Michael, arrived with a paper in hand and a worried expression. "You need to see this," he said. James looked up, took the sheet, read. It was an open letter, published in the New York Times, signed by Eleanor Braithwaite herself. "To the man who played my husband's final song, thank you. You reminded us that the most valuable gifts come without signatures or speeches. That music is not just art, but truth. We failed you when we judged your coat instead of your soul. I do not know your full story, but I know pain when I hear it. If you're reading this, come back. Not for us, but for the world that still needs to be healed by what you carry. Sincerely, Eleanor Braithwaite." James closed the paper slowly, the edges soft in his hands. He sat back. For a long time he said nothing. Michael waited, then finally asked, "Will you answer her?" James stared at the ceiling for a moment. Not in words. He rose from the piano and walked toward the closet, pulling out an old case. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a handwritten manuscript. The last song he had written before the crash. It had never been played. He placed it gently atop the piano. Then he took a deep breath. That night, at exactly 8 p.m., a new video was uploaded, the same account. No captions, just an image of a piano under a single light. The song began slowly, unsure of itself at first, like a child taking its first step into a memory. Then it swelled, tender and broken, but also full of hope. And within hours, the comments began again. "This is the same man. He's answering her. This feels like forgiveness. Eleanor watched the video from her living room, hands clasped, eyes swimming. By the end, she was smiling through her tears. Across the country, schools began playing his music in their morning assemblies. Children hummed it while walking home. Parents listened in their cars and cried for reasons they couldn't quite name. People weren't just listening. They were remembering. And that was exactly what James wanted. Not a legacy, just remembrance. The photograph was still there, taped to the back of the upright piano, yellowing at the corners from time and breath and grief. James sat across from it in silence, his fingertips grazing the ivory keys like they were fragile bone. In the picture, his daughter Grace was laughing so hard her face blurred in motion. Her head tilted back against the late autumn sun, hair catching fire in the light. Beside her, his wife Elaine was watching her, not the camera. Always her. James had taken the photo with one hand while his other rested on Grace's shoulder, the way a man touches something too precious to last. It had been 3 years since the plane went down, a routine flight, a slight storm, a mechanical failure. He had declined to join them that day, buried in a board meeting that ran long and felt eternal. He never forgave himself. He remembered the last thing Grace ever said to him, standing barefoot at the foot of their stairs. "Dad, promise you'll finish the song." He had started it that week, something light, playful, written in G major for her recital. But after the crash, the melody grew darker. Whole measures were erased in angry silence. Some nights he would rise at 2 a.m., play one note, and walk away. He never finished it. Not until the night of the gala. Now, the manuscript of that very piece sat next to Eleanor's parchment on the table. 2 songs written for 2 children taken too soon. 2 different kinds of grief. And yet, somehow the same. James didn't play that morning. Instead, he walked, through the quiet bustle of downtown, past the bookstore cafe where the barista knew his name only as Mr. Lawrence, and down to the West End Community Center, where music still spilled from half-cracked windows like secrets too stubborn to keep. Inside, children were practicing on upright pianos, missing a few keys. Some banged chaotically, others pressed softly. One small girl, no older than 7, was seated alone at the end of the row. Her posture was perfect. Her fingers, delicate. She wasn't playing scales. She was playing a lullaby. He recognized it instantly. It was his. The song he played at the gala. He approached her slowly, afraid to interrupt whatever miracle was unfolding. "Do you like that piece?" he asked gently. She turned, startled. Her eyes were wide and luminous. A scar ran across her jaw, light, barely visible, but it shifted when she smiled. "My teacher taught it to me yesterday," she said. "I didn't know music could feel like this." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said, "Like someone was holding my hand, even if no one's there." James blinked. "What's your name?" "Ava." He knelt beside her. "Do you know who wrote that song?" She shook her head. "But I think they were very sad." He nodded. "Yes, but also, they remembered how to hope." She studied him. Her eyes flicked over his weathered face, his beard, his coat. Something in her gaze softened. "Was it you?" she whispered. James didn't answer. He simply sat beside her, and together they played. Her right hand, his left. Notes falling like morning light, one melody, 2 hearts. In a corner of the room, the music director, Miss Carmen Silva, watched with tears quietly brimming. She had seen enough prodigies, enough broken men, enough accidental salvations to recognize that this wasn't music. This was resurrection. Later that afternoon, back at the conservatory, Eleanor Braithwaite stood before a board of skeptical donors. Their suits were pressed, their expressions carefully composed. "He humiliated us," one said coldly. "He made fools of our guests," added another. Eleanor remained calm. "He exposed our arrogance," she said, "and we deserved it." The room stiffened. She continued, "That man gave us something more sacred than money or reputation. He reminded us why music exists, not for opulence, not for posture, but for healing." The youngest member of the board, mid-30s, quiet until now, cleared her throat. "Then let's do something with that," she said. "Let's name next year's gala after the children the songs were written for, and invite him, officially." "And if he refuses?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Then we'll still play his music, with or without him." By nightfall, a new post appeared on the anonymous video account. This time, it was Ava. She sat at a park piano, fingers trembling slightly, the crowd around her casual, unaware of what was about to happen. She played the song, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but with all the quiet courage of a heart that had learned to sing through scars. And James, watching from the bench beneath a tree, closed his eyes as her final note lingered. Sometimes, the truest legacy is not in being known, but in being felt. It started with a ripple. A teacher in Ohio shared the video of Ava playing the gala song with her music class. Then a retired soldier in Texas posted a message beneath it. "This melody got me through a night I didn't think I'd survive." A mother in Oregon played it for her autistic son who hadn't spoken a word in 3 weeks, and he whispered, "Play it again." By the end of the week, the melody had a name, Grace's song. No one knew who had written it. But everyone seemed to understand why it had been written. It became more than a piece of music. It became a balm. In subway stations, young buskers stumbled through its soft rises and mournful valleys. In churches, choirs began arranging vocal versions. Even hospitals began looping it in waiting rooms, reporting drops in anxiety among their patients. People weren't just listening, they were letting go. Meanwhile, James watched the world from his quiet corner of it. Each morning, he folded a newspaper he never finished. Each night, he walked the city as though he were trying to memorize it. And all the while, he kept thinking of Ava, her small hands, her bright eyes, the way she looked at him without an ounce of judgment. One morning, Michael entered James's apartment with urgency rippling under his usually composed face. They found out. James didn't look up from his coffee. Who? Everyone. Michael dropped a magazine on the table. Time. The cover was simple, a photo of the back of a man seated at a public piano in a gray coat. The caption read, "The billionaire who vanished and returned through music." James stared at it for a long moment. "So, it begins." He didn't sound afraid, just tired. Tired in the way a man sounds when the grief he's carried privately has been dragged finally into the light. The media storm was relentless. Headlines shouted his name across the world. Tech titan turned phantom pianist. James Langford's Secret Symphony. Widower's melody becomes nation's prayer. Requests flooded in. Interviews, award shows, speaking engagements. His foundation's inbox crashed under the weight of them. But James refused them all, except one. It came in the form of a letter, handwritten with an ink-smudged signature. "Ava. Dear Mr. Langford, I hope it's okay I know your name now. Miss Silva told me. I won't tell anyone if you don't want me to. But I wanted to say thank you. I used to think I wasn't good at anything. People at school said I was too quiet, but when I play your song, I don't feel quiet. I feel like someone hears me. I'm playing at my school concert next week. Will you come? You don't have to, but I'll leave the front row seat empty. Just in case. Love, Ava." James folded the letter and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he said yes. He didn't arrive with security or entourage. He didn't wear a suit. Just a soft gray sweater, jeans, and the same quiet expression that had walked into the gala weeks before. The auditorium was small, packed with folding chairs and parents with camcorders and bouquets of grocery store flowers. James sat in the front row, unnoticed at first, his presence as unassuming as the autumn leaves clinging to the window glass outside. And then Ava stepped on stage. Her dress was a little too long. Her shoes squeaked when she walked. But she sat at the piano with the gravity of someone carrying something sacred. She didn't speak, she played, and the room faded. James didn't hear the piano. He heard Grace's laughter, floating across the lake. He heard Elaine humming softly in the kitchen, a glass of wine in hand. He heard the life that had been, rising through Ava's small hands and spilling into the air as though nothing was ever truly gone. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But James didn't stand. Couldn't. He just looked up as Ava's eyes found his, and for a moment, the entire room disappeared. She smiled, he smiled back. And something in him broke open, not with pain, but with light. After the concert, as families gathered for juice boxes and cookies and too many photos, Ava slipped away and found him sitting alone beneath the trophy case. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it." They sat together for a while, not talking, just breathing. Then she asked, "Will you play again? In front of people?" James looked at her, the question stretching between them like a bridge, and he whispered, "Maybe, but only if you play with me." She beamed. 3 weeks later, James Langford walked on stage at a benefit concert organized by Eleanor Braithwaite. The lights were warm, the room filled with people who had once mocked him but now sat in reverent anticipation. And beside him, on the second bench, sat Ava, feet not quite touching the ground, eyes steady as stars. The curtain rose, and together they played. The final chord shimmered into silence like breath caught in candlelight. No one moved, not even the air. For a full 10 seconds after the last note dissolved, the auditorium held itself still, shoulders suspended, lungs forgotten. The moment was too delicate for clapping. It felt as though any sound would shatter the invisible thread connecting every heart in that room. James lifted his hands from the keys slowly, like a man laying something to rest. Ava's small fingers hovered just above the last ivory note she'd touched, then curled into her lap. She turned to look at him, her chest rising and falling like a paper boat on the edge of a wave. He gave her the faintest nod, not approval, not instruction, gratitude. Then the standing ovation began. Not in a wave, but in a trembling rise. One by one they stood. The man in the third row who had once mocked his coat, the concertmaster from the symphony who had doubted his presence. Eleanor, standing tallest of them all, her hands pressed together at her chest, tears racing down her cheeks in quiet surrender. Backstage, Carmen Silva sobbed silently into her hands, her shoulders shaking with something more sacred than pride. But James didn't bow, he didn't bask. He simply took Ava's hand, warm and nervous in his, and led her off stage as if guiding a fragile truth back into the world it had just transformed. In the green room, Ava finally exhaled. She clutched her water bottle with both hands and looked up at him with wide blinking eyes. I thought I was going to faint. You didn't, James said gently, handing her a towel. Was I okay? He crouched beside her. You were the bridge. She tilted her head. What do you mean? You took something broken and made it carry people. Ava didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just looked at him for a long time, and James saw something in her expression he hadn't seen in a very long time. Hope that didn't ask questions. Love that didn't need reasons. Outside the room, a reporter tried to push her way past the event staff. Just one question, Mr. Langford. Why the mystery? Why the disguise? Why now? James looked toward the door, the voice like a fly against stained glass. He didn't move. Instead, he reached for his coat and helped Ava into hers. He had no answers that fit inside a headline. He had no quotes that could replace silence. What he had was a song. And that had been enough. The next morning, Eleanor Braithwaite stood at her husband's grave in Brookfield Cemetery, the morning dew still clinging to the grass. The stone was simple, the way Samuel had wanted, his name, his years, and a quote from a letter he had once written her. Even if the music ends, I'll still be listening. She laid a copy of the concert program beside the headstone. Her fingers brushed the page as if to say, I kept my promise. Then she turned, the wind pulling gently at her shawl, and walked to her car, where James waited in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the empty chapel nearby. I brought the manuscript, she said softly as she slid into the driver's seat. He nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached into her bag and handed it to him. Samuel's original draft of Solace in G minor, worn at the edges, the ink faded where grief had smudged it decades ago. James turned the pages slowly, reverently. He didn't ask why she was giving it to him. He already knew. Finish it, she said. James glanced at her. I thought it was finished. It isn't, Eleanor replied. There's more to say now. They drove in silence. The city outside the windshield bathed in the soft gold of late afternoon. Children crossed streets in packs, laughter echoing between buildings. Musicians played on corners. A mother knelt beside her son, tying his shoe as he pointed toward a balloon caught in a tree. It was a world still full of little songs. Back at his apartment, James sat at the piano with the manuscript open before him. The melody came slowly, hesitant, almost afraid. But then it grew. Not louder. Braver. He added measures that weren't his, but they were. Because somehow, over time, Samuel's sorrow and his own had intertwined, note by note, until the line between them vanished like mist. He wrote through dinner, through sunset, through the hush of night, and by dawn it was done. He closed the final bar with a quiet flourish, signed both their names, and leaned back in his chair with tears tracing the angles of his face. He didn't cry often, but when he did, it wasn't from sadness. It was from release. 3 days later, Eleanor held a private gathering at the conservatory. No press, no cameras, just family, friends, and a few guests who had learned, slowly, how to listen. James played the new version of Solace in G minor, and when he finished, he didn't leave the stage. He stood and spoke. My daughter asked me once to finish a song I started. I told her I didn't know how, but she believed I would. His voice cracked. Tonight, I believe it too. Then he turned to Ava. And next time, we'll write something new. She smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet joy that hadn't existed in her when they met. Outside, it began to snow. Soft flakes drifted across the parking lot, landing silently on windshields and shoulders, on the roof of the piano hall and the marble of the stairs. And as the guests stepped out, no one rushed, no one shouted, no one pulled out phones. They just stood in the snow, listening, as if somewhere in the hush between falling flakes, they could still hear the music. The first letter arrived on a Monday. It was written in crayon, blue, uneven, the handwriting jagged with the charming stubbornness of childhood. No return address, no full name. Just, "Dear Mr. Piano Man, my dad cried when you played. I never seen him do that. Can you teach me too?" By Friday, there were 53 more. Some arrived folded into children's drawings of pianos beneath bright yellow suns. Others came from hospitals, shelters, juvenile centers. One letter, written by an elderly woman from Maine, simply said, "I heard your new version of Solace. I forgave my sister after 40 years. James didn't know what to do with them at first. He laid them out across his dining table like pieces of some unseen constellation. One by one, he read them aloud in the quiet stillness of his apartment, the sun crawling slowly across the floor like a child too shy to speak. It wasn't just the music anymore. It was what the music made people do. In towns and cities across the country, a new movement began, quietly, without branding or slogans. They called it the Solace Project. It wasn't an organization. It wasn't funded. It simply spread. Church choirs began leaving an empty chair at each rehearsal, for someone they'd lost, or someone who hadn't yet come back. Street performers started playing the first 5 notes of Grace's song before beginning their sets, like a whispered invocation. And most stunning of all, music schools began opening their doors to children who couldn't afford lessons. No application, no forms, just a piano, a teacher, and a promise. Someone believed in you first. Eleanor's conservatory was the first to announce the new scholarship program, the Langford Initiative. When she unveiled it, James didn't stand on stage beside her. He sat in the back of the room, beside Ava, who wore a sunflower pin and a little too much hairspray. She looked up at him once as Eleanor spoke and whispered, "You don't have to be in front to change everything." He smiled. "I learned that from you." The room applauded as Eleanor closed her remarks. But Ava had already stood up. No one expected it. She stepped onto the stage with a folded sheet of paper and a shaky voice. "I wrote something," she said. "It's a poem and a thank you." She unfolded the paper, her fingers trembling. "I used to think music was just for fancy people, with dresses and big halls and cameras. But I was wrong. Music is for the quiet ones, the people who feel everything and say nothing. It's for the kids who cry in bathrooms and the dads who never learned how to cry. It's for people who left and the ones still waiting for them. It's for the days that hurt and the nights that hold us anyway. Mr. Langford didn't teach me a song. He taught me how to stay when the world wants to leave, and how to listen, even when it hurts." She looked up, eyes shimmering. "Thank you." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was deep. It rolled through the room like a hush after prayer, humble, reverent, changed. After the event, as the guests filtered out beneath strings of warm lights and soft music playing from hidden speakers, Eleanor approached James with something in her hand. "I found this in Samuel's old files," she said. "Thought it might belong to you now." It was a journal, leather-bound. Inside were sketches of compositions, phrases never finished, ideas scribbled in the margins. One page was marked with a ribbon. James opened it. At the top, Grace and Solace, 2 parts of one song. He swallowed. It was dated the month before Eleanor's daughter died. James ran his hand over the page. "Maybe we were always meant to meet," she said gently. He nodded, eyes glassy. "I think we were always playing the same melody, just in different rooms." That night, back in his apartment, James couldn't sleep. He sat at his piano, journal open beside him, and began to write. Not alone. Ava's notes joined his. What began as Grace's song and solace in G minor now became something new. No longer mourning, no longer incomplete. A duet. A final piece. They called it Hymn for the Unspoken. The premiere was held on the anniversary of Grace's birthday, in a concert hall filled not with dignitaries or cameras, but with children, families, teachers, janitors, nurses, and silent watchers who'd been listening from the beginning. James and Ava walked on stage hand in hand. No words, just the music. And as it rose, soft at first like a whispered apology, it became clear. This wasn't a performance. It was a return. Not to fame, not to power, but to each other. To the hearts that had waited in the quiet, to the hands that still shook when reaching for beauty, to the voices too afraid to speak, but brave enough to listen. And when the final note faded into silence once more, no one stood. No one clapped. They just sat together. In stillness, in grace. He stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time before he stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight like it remembered him. Dust floated through the amber light that spilled through the old lace curtains, motes dancing in the silence, as if the house had been waiting. Not just in stillness, but in longing. It was the first time James had returned to the lake house since the accident. No one else had been here. Not the staff, not the trustees, not the cleaners who had offered to tidy things up. He'd kept it locked. Not because he wanted to preserve it, but because he couldn't face it. Not until now. The grand piano still sat by the bay window, half covered in a sheet. One of Grace's pink hair clips lay on the keys, still there, just as she'd left it after her last lesson. He walked slowly to the piano, then knelt down, running his fingers beneath the bench. They were still there, the drawings, crayon doodles on ripped paper, little hearts with musical notes, one with stick figures labeled, "Me Stat equals music." He pressed them to his chest, breath trembling, eyes burning with the ache of something both broken and beautiful. He didn't cry, he played, not for the world, not for an audience, just for them. A slow, simple lullaby in G. The original one. The one he never finished. And somehow, this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a homecoming. 2 days later, James quietly announced a new wing to be built on the property. Not a memorial, a sanctuary. A music camp for children with grief, trauma, or silence too large for words. A place not to speak, but to feel, through piano and strings and song. It would be named Camp Grace and Solace. He didn't want publicity, but the story told itself, and before long, applications began to pour in. Letters from war zones, orphanages, foster homes, from children and adults who had never held an instrument, but had held pain. Eleanor pledged the first endowment. Ava offered to teach twice a year. Even Carmen Silva sent a message that read, "If there's a single stool and a broken violin, I'll be there." The movement had grown beyond them. In Tokyo, a choir arranged Hymn for the Unspoken into a breathtaking piece for 200 voices. In Nairobi, a girl played Grace's song on a xylophone made of scrap metal, her feet dancing as if defying the very earth that tried to hold her back. And in a hospital in Brazil, doctors reported that a young boy in a coma for weeks had squeezed his mother's hand when the melody played on the room's speakers. James didn't see himself in any of it. He saw Grace. He saw Elaine. He saw Ava. He saw people who had decided that loss wasn't the end of something sacred, just the beginning of something they were brave enough to carry forward. But there was still one thing left, one place he hadn't gone, one note he hadn't played. So one evening, he drove alone. Back to the airfield. The wreckage was long gone, replaced with trees now soft and forgiving in the golden hour light. But the place was the same. He stood at the edge of the small overlook near the clearing. In his hand was a small tin. Inside, the dried petals of Grace's last bouquet, tied with a ribbon she'd made at summer camp. He sat on the grass, opened his phone, played a recording. It was Ava, playing Hymn for the Unspoken, just the melody, no harmony, no embellishment, just the thread of sound. He closed his eyes and listened. The wind wrapped itself around him like an old friend. Birds called from distant treetops, and the music, soft and trembling, moved through the quiet space like a breath in prayer. Then slowly he opened the tin and let the petals go. They lifted gently into the wind, scarlet, gold, ivory, swirling upward like memory given wings. He whispered, "I finished it, sweetheart." His voice cracked. "And I think I'm going to be okay." Back at the cabin that night, Ava sat curled up with Eleanor near the fire, sipping cocoa. Carmen was on the porch, tuning a battered violin. Across the lawn, lanterns had been lit. The first group of campers would arrive in 2 days. James stepped inside, quietly. Ava turned, eyes lighting up. "Did you go?" He nodded. "I let her know." She smiled, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "I wrote something." She handed it to him. It was a dedication, to the ones we lost and the ones we still carry, to the songs we never finished and the words we were too scared to say, to the quiet that became our teacher, to the silence that taught us how to listen. "This camp is for you, and so is the music." He folded it gently and placed it on the mantel beside a photograph of Grace. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something shift inside. Not an ending, a soft beginning. The buses arrived in the soft blush of morning. They came rumbling down the gravel drive with sleepy heads pressed to windows and fingers drumming against backpacks, unaware that the place they were about to step into had been built on grief and hope in equal measure. Camp Grace and Solace didn't look like much from the outside. Just cabins tucked beneath whispering pine, a wide lawn stretching toward a lake still wrapped in mist, and a small chapel that wasn't for prayer, but for music. But the moment they stepped off the bus, they felt it. Not magic, not ceremony, but safety. Real safety, the kind you can feel in your chest before you understand it in your mind. James stood near the flagpole, dressed simply in jeans and a navy sweater, his hands tucked into his pockets. He watched the children file out, some laughing nervously, others gripping their duffels like armor. A few looked around and saw nothing. Others looked around and saw everything. He had seen those expressions before. They mirrored the face that once stared back at him in the mirror, the night he buried his daughter. Ava stood beside him, her curls caught in a braid and tucked under a sun hat too big for her head. She held a clipboard she didn't need, and a smile that looked stitched together with courage. Carmen Silva trailed behind with her violin case, waving at a young boy who peeked out from behind his older brother. Every child came with a story. None of them told it aloud. But it hung in the air anyway, in glances, silences, in the way some refused to meet anyone's eyes, and others clung to music sheets like lifelines. After orientation, the campers were led through icebreakers, then lunch under the canopy of oak. But it wasn't until they were brought into the music hall that something shifted. Ava took the lead. She stood at the front of the room, a piano behind her, and spoke gently. "We don't expect you to be good. We don't expect you to be ready. We don't even expect you to play," she said. "We just want you to feel. Music doesn't ask you to explain. It just asks you to show up." Then she sat and began to play. Not a full song, just notes. Broken, wandering, uncertain. Then Carmen joined in with her violin, low and longing, filling the space with sound that didn't feel like a performance, but like a confession. One by one, the children began to lean forward. Some closed their eyes, some wiped their cheeks. By the time Ava stopped playing, no one clapped. They just sat there, together. And for many, that was already more than they dared to expect. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake and the trees cast long, dappled shadows across the grass, James sat alone on a bench near the dock, watching the ripples move across the water. He didn't notice the footsteps until they stopped behind him. "I didn't think you'd come," a woman's voice said, soft and worn. He turned. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. Then he did. Elaine's sister, Margot. They hadn't spoken since the funeral. She had blamed him, and he hadn't disagreed. He stood slowly, unsure whether to speak or simply walk away. But she stepped closer. "You look tired," she said. He gave a soft breath of something like a laugh. "I think I've been tired for a very long time." She nodded. They both looked out at the lake again. Then she whispered, she'd be proud of this. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was tender. "I never hated you, James," she said. "I just didn't know where to put the pain, and you were the only one still standing." He looked down at his hands. "I blamed myself," he murmured, "every day." "I know." He met her eyes then. They weren't angry anymore, just tired and forgiving. She pulled something from her bag, a photograph, frayed at the corners. It was of Grace and Ava years ago, playing at the gala in matching dresses, both grinning with the kind of reckless joy that only exists in childhood. "She'd want you to keep going," Margot said. He didn't reply. He just held the photo to his chest and sat back down. Margot sat beside him, and together they watched the stars come out. The next day, Ava led a journaling session while Carmen worked with the more musically inclined kids, teaching them how to create their own version of Grace's song. But James wandered the paths alone for a while, stopping occasionally to help a child tie a shoe or adjust a guitar strap. At one point, he passed a boy, small, withdrawn, standing in front of the chapel door, too afraid to go in. James knelt beside him. "First day's hard, huh?" The boy didn't respond. "What's your name?" "Emil." James smiled gently. "You want to tell me your story?" The boy shook his head violently. "That's okay," James said. "You want to play your story?" Emil looked up, and for the first time he nodded. James led him inside, sat him at the smallest upright, and stood behind him. One note, then two, then silence. Emil began again, and slowly his story emerged, not through words, not through posture, but through sound. Raw, fragmented, real. By the time he finished, tears streamed down his face. James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he whispered. That night, as the camp gathered for its first ever twilight concert, each child played a single note, standing before the group and striking a single key of their choosing, adding to a collective composition called the Circle of Sound. No one judged, no one corrected. It was imperfect, beautiful music, and it was theirs. As Ava played the final note and let it fade into the dusk, fireflies danced across the field, and James, standing near the edge of the crowd, looked up toward the stars, his eyes damp but steady. This wasn't closure. It was something better. Continuation. There was something sacred in the way the light moved that morning. Not the sun exactly, but the stillness it left behind as it crept through the trees. It was the final day of camp, and the air felt thick with the kind of quiet that only arrives when something unforgettable is coming to an end. Children walked slower. Conversations softened. Even the wind through the pines sounded like it was holding its breath. James stood at the chapel doors, his hand resting gently on the wooden frame. His eyes swept the field, the cabins, the music tents, the benches now worn smooth by 7 days of sitting, singing, and stories never told aloud. This place had begun as a way to remember his daughter. Now, it felt like something she'd built herself. Inside the chapel, rows of mismatched chairs faced a small stage framed by ivy. At the center of that stage, a single grand piano. On the bench, waiting patiently, sat a blank music book with a soft linen cover. It would be filled by day's end. Ava darted in from the side door, her arms full of folded programs, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill and quiet anticipation. She gave James a quick smile, one they'd both come to understand required no words, and began placing the programs on each seat. Every child had written something inside those pages. A lyric, a drawing, a single note, no names. Just a shared language, just the music of healing. When the clock struck 10, the room filled with the soft rustling of nervous feet and hopeful hearts. Parents had been invited, and donors. But the best seats, those in the first row, were left for the campers themselves. James stood beside the piano, wearing the same simple sweater he'd worn that night at the gala, years ago now. He didn't open with a speech. He opened with silence. The kind that asked for presence, not attention. Then he nodded toward Ava. She stepped forward, not with a microphone, not with a flourish, just her voice. "We all came here with something we didn't want to carry alone, and we didn't fix anything, we didn't cure anything, but we learned how to listen." A pause, to ourselves, to each other, to the sound that grief makes when it's brave enough to come out. She turned toward the piano. James joined her. Together they began to play. The piece was new. It had no title. It wasn't even written in full yet. But it had all the familiar threads. The softness of Grace's song, the weight of Solace, the trembling ache of hymn for the unspoken. It was everything they had lived through, shaped not by perfection but by truth. And then as the second movement began, the children began to rise. One by one. Each child stepped forward, playing a single note they had chosen during the week, just one. Some hands shook, some fingers missed, but none of it mattered. Because with each note, the room grew stronger, fuller, wider, until the final child, Emil, stepped forward. He sat on the bench beside Ava, both his feet swinging above the floor. He pressed a single F key, then turned to James. Their eyes met, and James nodded. The boy played another, then another, and Ava followed, Then James. The music spilled over the chapel like sunlight through stained glass. When the last note faded, no applause came, only stillness, only breath, only awe. Margot stood slowly. Eleanor reached for her cane but didn't rise. Her eyes were wet and closed, hands folded in her lap like prayer. Then Ava stepped to the front once more. She raised her hands, not to wave but to still the air, and whispered, "There's one more piece." The room shifted. Soft murmurs. James sat back at the piano, pulled a slip of paper from his jacket, and unfolded it. It was the final page of a letter. Elaine's handwriting. It had been found weeks ago in a drawer at the lake house, folded behind a book of lullabies. He placed it on the music stand and began to play. The letter's words unfolded across the melody, his voice low, barely more than breath. "James, if you ever find this, don't stop, don't disappear. Don't turn our silence into your grave. Grace would want you to finish the music. I want you to live inside it. We're still here. You just have to listen." The music deepened. Each measure felt like a heartbeat stitched back together, a soft redemption, a quiet resurrection. When the song ended, he didn't look up. He simply sat there, fingers still resting on the keys, eyes full. The room remained still for what felt like eternity. Then, softly, from the back, a young girl began to hum. A single thread of melody. Then another voice joined, then another, until the chapel, once wrapped in grief, now filled with song. Not rehearsed, not perfect, but whole. James stood, bowed his head, and stepped down from the stage. He didn't need applause. He didn't need titles. He didn't even need to be remembered. He just needed to know the music would continue. Outside, the sky had opened, blue and endless. The lake shimmered like a polished mirror. The trees swayed like they were dancing to the wind's own lullaby. Ava ran to catch up with him. "Where to now?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon, his face bathed in sunlight. "Anywhere there's silence." She grinned. "So we can fill it?" He shook his head gently. "So we can listen." And together they walked, not toward an end, but into the next song, waiting patiently for them to begin. To anyone who has ever been silenced by loss, shame, or doubt, this story is for you. James Langford didn't return to the world with fame, fortune, or a spotlight. He returned with music born from sorrow and a heart that had been broken wide open by grief. What began as one man sitting at a piano in silence became a global movement that reminded us, healing doesn't roar, it whispers. And sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones told with words, but with notes, pauses, and the courage to feel. This story teaches us that pain doesn't have to be loud to be real. That redemption can come quietly, through a single act of vulnerability. That legacy is not built in wealth, but in how we make others feel seen, heard, and held. So if you've lost something, someone, or even yourself, know this. You are not alone in the silence. You are not forgotten in your stillness, and your music, whatever form it takes, is still waiting to be played. Let the world hear it.